Imagine it's 24 February 2022. You are a 43-year-old procurement manager living in Moscow, Russia. You live in a beige apartment block just beyond the Garden Ring, with a wife who teaches literature and a son who likes model trains. You have money in a state bank, a small emergency stack of cash in a kitchen drawer, and a habit of checking prices every Saturday at the supermarket near Prospect Mira. Your job is boring in the most comforting way possible. Order machine parts, confirm invoices, chase late shipments, drink bad office coffee, go home. The elevator in your building rattles, the radiators hiss, and the news on television sounds far away, like weather over another sea. You think wars begin with soldiers and maps, not with bank wires, shipping insurance, and the tiny chips hidden inside industrial machines. If you have ever wondered how great powers can start fighting long before most people hear a single shot, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory, it is a pattern. It has happened before. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Then, your phone begins to buzz, the ruble falls, foreign suppliers stop answering. One customer asks whether a payment sent that morning will still clear by evening. Another asks if spare parts from Germany are still coming. They are not military questions. They are questions about bearings, software updates, packaging film, and blood pressure medicine. And that is the point. By the time most people notice an economic war, it has already moved into their kitchen, their pay packet, and the shelves of the local store. This video is about that quiet war between East and West, how states turn trade into pressure, finance into leverage, and dependence into a weapon. Not someday, not in theory. History shows it is already how major powers compete when open conflict is too dangerous, too expensive, or too uncertain. Before we go further, there's something important to understand. Economic war does not usually look like war. It looks like paperwork. It looks like a customs delay, a frozen payment, a denied export license, a missing shipment, a bank that suddenly asks one more question it never asked before. On the surface, everything still seems normal. The shops are open, the trains run, the lights stay on, but the rot is in the beams, not on the paint. Think of the modern world like a giant apartment building with one shared boiler room. Every country lives in its own flat, but the heat, water, and electricity run through common pipes. If one tenant controls the valves, and another tenant depends on that flow, then politics can become plumbing. You do not need to burn the building down. You only need to tighten a valve slowly enough that people shiver before they understand what is happening. That is the core mechanism. Dependence. Not simple trade, but concentrated dependence. One side needs something it cannot quickly replace. Oil, chips, machine tools, payment access, reserve currency, rare minerals, shipping insurance, industrial software. The other side may not control everything, but it controls enough of the choke points. A choke point is just a narrow passage where a lot of traffic must pass, like a bridge over a river. Control the bridge, and you do not need to own the whole country. You only need to decide who crosses. History shows the same pattern again and again. First comes efficiency. Countries buy from whoever is cheapest, fastest, or best. Then comes concentration. Supply chains get deep and narrow. Then comes tension. A border clash, a sanctions regime, a trade dispute, a military crisis. And then suddenly, what looked like peaceful interdependence turns into leverage. The network becomes a trap. The ladder that helped both sides climb becomes the rope one side pulls away. This brings us directly to the first part of the story. In the summer of 1941, Japan was not yet a starving country. Its cities were busy. Its factories still moved. Ordinary people still woke up, ate breakfast, and went to work. But the empire had built its machine on imported fuel. According to the Imperial War Museums in 1939, all but 6% of Japan's oil supply was imported, and roughly 80% came from the United States alone. That meant Japan imported about 94% of its oil, and most of that lifeline came from one country. It was like running a vast steel mill with one single extension cord. American policymakers understood exactly what that meant. U.S. records show that export restrictions on certain petroleum products began on July 26, 1940, and tightened as the crisis deepened. Then, after Japan moved further into French Indochina, Washington froze Japanese assets on July 26, 1941. Britain and the Dutch followed with their own embargoes. In one move, Japan lost access to most of the fuel that kept its empire moving. The oil did not explode, it simply stopped flowing. Imagine what that felt like at street level. You are not an admiral in Tokyo, you are a tram mechanic in Osaka, or a clerk whose husband drives a delivery truck. You are not thinking about strategy papers. You are thinking about kerosene, bus schedules, factory hours, rationing, rumors. Quiet wars are strange that way. Decisions made in ministries arrive in ordinary homes disguised as inconvenience. Then inconvenience becomes shortage, then shortage becomes fear. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. The oil pressure worked. It worked so well that it helped convince Japanese leaders they were running out of time. That does not excuse the horrors that followed, but it does show the brutal logic of economic coercion. If a state believes its industrial lungs are being squeezed, it may retreat, bargain, or lash out. Japan chose the third path. By December 1941, the Pacific was on fire. There's another detail that most people do not know. Quiet economic war is rarely one dramatic switch thrown in a dark room. It is usually a staircase. A U.S. State Department document from April 1941 shows officials arguing over petroleum exports in fine detail. By that point, the department had already licensed about 9.2 million barrels of gasoline for export to Japan and had about 2 million more barrels in pending applications. The same document noted that since July 26th, it had licensed roughly 22 million barrels of crude oil for export, much of it not yet shipped. In other words, even as relations worsened, both sides were still tied together by existing contracts, administrative decisions, and the slow mechanics of trade. The rope was not cut in one motion. It was first measured, then tightened, then yanked. That matters because modern viewers often imagine economic war as clean and binary. Sanctioned or not sanctioned. Blockaded or not blockaded. History is messier. It moves through ministries, licenses, shipping manifests, and exceptions. One grade of fuel may be blocked while another still moves. One bank may clear payments while another refuses. One cargo may leave port while the next one stalls. To ordinary people, this feels like living inside fog. The system is neither fully open nor fully shut. It is half open, which can be even more destabilizing because businesses cannot plan around uncertainty. A factory can survive bad news more easily than it can survive, maybe. The lesson is larger than Pearl Harbor. Economic war is not always the alternative to military war. Sometimes it is the corridor that leads toward it. The same mechanism appears again and again. One side depends on a vital resource. The other side learns that control over trade can shape political behavior faster than diplomacy and more quietly than bombs. What looks like commerce becomes command. Now here's where it gets interesting. Economic pressure does not only happen between enemies, sometimes it happens between partners, allies, and countries bound together by trade itself. Here's something I want you to think about before we go further. When does economic cooperation stop being cooperation and start becoming discipline? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously, because what I'm about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear, and it changes everything. On September 22nd, 1985, the finance ministers and central bank governors of France, West Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States met at the Plaza Hotel in New York. The official goal was to bring down an overvalued dollar. In plain English, the dollar had become too strong, and Washington wanted its major partners to help push it lower. Japan agreed. What followed was not a tank invasion or a naval blockade. It was an exchange rate shock. A currency shock is when the value of money moves so fast that businesses, banks, and households cannot adjust in time. A Bank of Japan study shows how violent that move was. Just before the Plaza Accord on September 20th, 1985, the exchange rate was 242 yen to the dollar. By October 4th, it was 211. By November 7th, it was 202. By the end of April 1986, it had reached 160. In January 1987, it briefly touched 149. Imagine trying to run a major exporting economy while the ground beneath your feet is sliding like wet ice. For ordinary Japanese workers, this did not feel like high diplomacy. It felt like whiplash. Exporters faced pressure. Policymakers leaned on the financial system to keep growth alive. Cheap money flooded in, credit expanded, land prices and stock prices swelled. The bubble rose like bread dough left too long near a heater. At first, it looked warm and golden. Later, it collapsed. Then came another layer of pressure. On June 14, 1985, the Semiconductor Industry Association had filed a Section 301 petition in the United States, accusing Japan of unfair practices. On August 1, 1986, President Ronald Reagan approved the U.S.-Japan Semiconductor Agreement. The agreement, set to last until March 31, 1991, aimed to open the Japanese market to U.S. semiconductor exports and prevent dumping in the United States and third country markets. Again, no shots, no troops. But the message was clear. Market access, currency values, and technology leadership were now matters of state strategy. This was quiet economic war in a suit and tie. It showed that the battlefield was no longer just raw materials. It was also finance, pricing power, and technology standards. The East-West divide here was not a clean military frontier. It was a crowded boardroom table, but the pressure was real. A salaryman in Tokyo in 1987 did not need to understand foreign exchange intervention to feel its consequences. He saw asset prices soaring beyond reason. He saw office towers treated like treasure chests. He saw banks lend as if gravity had been suspended. Then, when the bubble burst in the early 1990s, he saw something even quieter and crueler. Lost years. Careers stalled, wages flattened. Confidence aged faster than people did. Collapse is not always a bang. Sometimes it is a long hallway with dimmer lights each year. Here the surprising fact is, not that governments intervened. Governments always intervene. The surprising fact is how quickly a quiet change in exchange rates can rearrange an entire social mood. A move from 242 yen to the dollar to 160 in a matter of months is not just a number on a trader's screen. It changes how exporters price goods, how banks estimate risk, how policymakers fear recession, and how much cheap credit they are tempted to pour into the system. In that sense, economic war can be like a doctor raising the wrong medicine to stop a fever. The patient looks stable for a while, the underlying illness worsens, and there is an even harder lesson inside the Japan story. Great powers do not need to formally call something economic warfare for it to function that way. They can describe it as coordination, stabilization, market opening, anti-dumping enforcement, or lawful trade remedy. The paperwork may be legal. The pressure may still be strategic. For ordinary citizens, the label matters less than the effect. If your wages flattened, your home becomes unaffordable, and your career prospects dim, you are living inside the outcome, whether the communique used polite language or not. The second lesson is simple. Once economic rivalry moves into currency, credit, and technology, the damage can spread far beyond the original dispute. It moves through the whole body of the economy like stress through a cracked foundation. The crack may begin in one corner. The whole house still feels it. This leads to the second part of this story. If the first case was about oil, and the second was about money and chips, the third is about rare earths. Rare earths are a group of minerals used in magnets, electronics, missiles, wind turbines, and many advanced industrial products. They sound obscure. They are not obscure at all. They are the hidden seasoning in modern industry. You do not notice them until the kitchen runs out. In September 2010, after a Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the Senkaku Islands, tensions flared between China and Japan. During that crisis, shipments of rare earths from China to Japan were disrupted. Reports at the time described an informal halt. China denied a formal embargo, but Japanese industry felt the squeeze, and that squeeze mattered because China dominated global supply. The U.S. Geological Survey report found that in 2008, China accounted for more than 90% of total world rare earth output. By 2009, world production was about 132,000 metric tons, and China produced 129,000 of those tons. Over the 15 years before 2011, China had supplied more than 80% of the world's rare earths and concentrates, chemicals, and intermediate products. In other words, the world had built advanced industry on a supply chain that ran through one country. For Japanese manufacturers, this was not an abstract headline. Production managers had to ask a simple, ugly question. How many weeks of inventory do we really have? Quiet economic war often begins with that question. Not who is right, not who is moral. How many weeks do we have? The dispute did not end in September 2010. It rolled forward into the legal machinery of world trade. On March 13, 2012, the United States requested consultations at the World Trade Organization over China's export restrictions on rare earths, tungsten, and molybdenum. A panel report came on March 26, 2014. The appellate body issued its report on August 7, 2014. The rulings were adopted on August 29, 2014. By May 20, 2015, China told the WTO it had removed the export duties, quotas, and trading rights restrictions covered by the dispute. This is another pattern worth noticing. Quiet economic war often has two speeds. First comes the shock, fast and political. Then comes the legal cleanup, slow and procedural. The wound happens first, the court case arrives later. Meanwhile, companies learned an ancient lesson in a modern form. If one supplier controls the tap, every factory downstream is renting its certainty. This is why rare earths mattered so much. Not because they were large in volume. They were not. Because they were small and hard to replace. A handful of grams can stop a machine worth millions. That is the secret of choke points. They are not powerful because they are big. They are powerful because they are necessary. Now observe what all of these cases have in common. In each one, years of efficiency created a narrow bridge. Japan had relied on American oil. Japan's growth model was exposed to US-led pressure through currencies and semiconductors. Advanced manufacturing had grown dependent on Chinese rare earths. The same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. Once politics entered the room, the narrow bridge turned into a toll gate. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for. The part they never put in textbooks. The 2010 rare earth shock produced adaptation. That is one of the most important and least discussed truths in economic history. Pressure creates pain, but pain also creates redesign. Japan reduced its dependence on rare earth imports from China from 85% in 2009 to 58% in 2020 through stockpiles, new suppliers, recycling, and substitutes. China, meanwhile, learned its own lessons. In April 2018, the United States hit ZTE with severe export restrictions after sanctions violations, nearly stopping the business. For Beijing, this was a warning siren. Semiconductors became a national security necessity. By 2020, China was importing more than $350 billion worth of semiconductors. Then came October 7th, 2022. New U.S. controls aimed to degrade the peak technological capability of China's semiconductor industry and hold certain thresholds out of reach. U.S. equipment exports to China fell significantly. The modern economy is a machine made of machines, and the side that controls the spare parts controls the system. The IMF warns that trade restrictions have tripled since 2019. Trade and investment between geopolitical blocs have declined, showing the world sorting itself by strategic trust. Phrases like friends-whoring and de-risking point to the fear that the cheapest supplier becomes the most dangerous dependency. Governments discover that every bolt is political. Middle layers of ordinary life feel the hurt first. In 2022, hundreds of billions in Russian sovereign assets were immobilized. Prices jumped and goods became scarce for ordinary people.